I want to start off with a question since so many of you are already using the chat box, and you can respond with, as many of you might recall from the last time we were together, a word or a phrase about I was thinking about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur over the last couple weeks. My feeling of needing to start over, that however much we say to each other Shana Tova, may it be a good year. I happen to be living in Israel, and I believe Julie also was in Israel during the second Intifada. We were there at different chapters of our lives back then. But one of the phrases that Israelis would use with each other around this time of year was not Shana Tova, but Shana Tova Yoter. Like, I don't know what a good year looks like, but let this year be a better year than last year. So I'm curious just check in with all of you, a word or two about what starting over feels like right now. And that could be some trepidation, a little bit of some fear, anxiety. That's okay. I'm not only looking for positive responses. Anxiety and a hope I see from Jay. That's right. A little bit of both, maybe. A dichotomy of feelings there. Patience, interesting. So Yvonne says that she's sort of maybe a wait and see kind of approach to what 5781 has in store for us. Give it maybe another 10, 15 seconds to see if anybody else wants to chime in about what starting over this, it cannot get worse. I was thinking about, there's a great Jewish joke about a Jewish pessimist says, it can't get any worse. And a Jewish optimist says, yes, it can. You have to, you're all muted, so I have no idea whether you're not laughing or, only Julie's apparently laughing. That's fine, it's fine. Reevaluating priorities, fear, working on and praying for strength, resilience, new goals and accomplishments, opportunity to write a new story, maybe my own story. Great. I thank you. Just there are, again, for this, there are no right or wrong answers, only if hopefully after Yom Kippur, you're answering honestly for yourself. I start here because one of the things that is so interesting for me about Sukkot is coming so quickly on the heels of Yamim Noraim, the high holidays, these days of awe, is that it's supposedly Zman Simchatenu. It's supposedly the time of our happiness. But one of the special readings, and the reading that ties into the Torah reading cycle for us in this class, is of Ecclesiastes, which is not exactly a book of happiness, joy, mirth. This is really a great representation of ancient Hebrew wisdom literature, as they say, of the non-prophetic writings. And the wisdom that Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, has for us is, some of the famous lines are, nothing is new under the sun, Hevel Havalim, all is vanity, and sort of how to have perspective on a world that we're just try to be even keeled because life sucks. He's not a really upbeat guy. And so it's interesting, again, so why would our ancient sages, why would the rabbis pair Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, with Sukkot, which they themselves deem to be Zman Simchatenu? And so what I want to suggest is, in the sense of following on the heels of the high holidays and the language that we use, especially on Rosh Hashanah, of Hayom Harat Olam, that Rosh Hashanah as the anniversary of creation, tying into, and specifically the anniversary of the creation of humanity, that we are still gaining perspective on this renewal. And in order to gain perspective on renewal, perhaps Kohelet goes to an extreme in terms of cynicism after all the hope and yearning of the high holidays, that we have the potential for newness and becoming newer, better people. that Kohelet is a voice within the tradition that's saying, yeah, but weren't you just here last year? Weren't you in just a similar position last year where you thought, oh, we're going to start over, it's going to be all bright and cheery, and I'm going to make all these resolutions, and we're going to have the potential for really becoming a new person? It's a lot harder than that, right? So what I want to present to you is a dichotomy here. That the rabbis chose this Kohelet reading, and we're not going to review too much of the Ecclesiastes text, really just one snippet, but then responses from within rabbinic tradition of how what renewal looks like according to our ancient sages, and more importantly, through that lens, what it can look like for us every day, not merely in this season, what every day a sense of renewal can look like. On balance, not merely about happiness and positivity, but about a certain sense of realism with ourselves to stay true to this season of recommitment and rededication of ourselves to our fullest potential, to be renewed and reborn at this time. So now I'll begin to share my screen. And with that framing, share screen. Okay. So, the title of this class is "Nothing New Under the Sun?" ? Not a question according to Ecclesiastes, but wanting to challenge that again. Rabbinic traditions of renewal versus Kohelet's cynicism. So this is a midrash from Kohelet Rabbah. This is the great midrashic collection of teachings from our sages about Ecclesiastes. And this passage begins with a quotation from Ecclesiastes 7:13. Consider God's doing. Who can straighten what God has twisted? When the Blessed Holy One created the first human, God, took him, the human, and led him round all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, consider my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. All that I have created, for your sake I created it. Pay heed that you do not corrupt and destroy my world. For if you corrupt it, there is no one to repair it after you. Not only that, but you will bring death to that righteous man, which is a euphemism, Tohat Sadiq, for Moses. So a number of you perhaps have seen this text before. It is a favorite in Jewish environmental circles to be included in a lot of text studies around Jewish environmentalism and its ancient sources. What I found funny when I rediscovered this text, it was that often they leave off that last line because it sort of steers away from the material of about the Garden of Eden alone, but as to the larger sort of biblical narrative implications here. The point, however, is that God created a human ecology, an ecology both for the Garden of Eden and for humanity within that context, and within that ecology, within that ecosystem, we were meant to behave in a certain way, and given misbehavior, not only did we get kicked out of that ecosystem, but that set up a very different kind of lifespan and life cycle than was perhaps initially intended. And the long-term implications are that somebody as righteous as Moses even becomes mortal as opposed to immortal. So there's meant to be an ethical teaching here about perhaps environmentalism, what we call it today, but about the choices that we make. What I want to suggest, however, is another reading of this, which is, given that our rabbis, our ancient sages, are imagining this drama playing out between God, the Blessed Holy One, and the Adam, the first human, before any of the drama ensues, but with the snake and the exile from the Garden of Eden, that God had some sense, according to the rabbis, that misbehavior might very well happen. So what what kind of warning is God trying to offer here? And given that they know how this plays out, what lesson are we, the audience, supposed to derive from this? Perhaps it is that actually there are a lot of the choices that we make in life. If we make mistakes, however much we want to be able to say, let's have a do-over, it's not that simple. There are actually irreversible implications for a lot of the things that happen in our lives. However much we want to be able to do teshuvah, engage in some repentance here and become better people, you can't always just take it back. You have to reconcile with the fact that there are real, concrete, and long-term repercussions for the mistakes that we make. However, and especially because we have never returned to the Garden of Eden and have yet to return, even according to those messianists among us who believe that in one vision that is actually the goal, to return to a Garden of Eden-like state of things. There is also the opportunity every day, every morning, to return to some of that primal energy. And that comes from the rabbi's own liturgy. Twice in the Shacharit service, this is the next text, we say one phrase, and I have to frame it by beginning with the blessing that opens the Shacharit service after Baruch Hu, leading into the recitation of the Shema. In the text that follows, the source text from Isaiah, but that the blessing, of course, is Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of time and space, forming light and creating darkness, bringing harmony while creating all. Come back to that first part in a second. And then twice in the ensuing paragraphs of that blessing do we find this phrase, HaMechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid, ma'aseh bereshit, that God is the one. This is praise for God as the one who renews through goodness, every day the work of creation. An incredible statement of praise and positivity. What does that mean? So first, we'll have to unpack the rabbi's rewriting of material from Isaiah 45 in the sense of what is this phrase, Oseh Shalom Uvarei et Hakol. So first of all, it's the rabbis taking something canonical, a famous statement from the prophet Isaiah, and saying, we can do better. That instead of Ani Hashem ve'ein od, I am the Lord and there is none else. Beside me there is no God. I form light and create darkness. I make weal, in the translation of the New Jewish Publication Society. I create weal and create woe. Yotzer or uvorei choshech, osei shalom uvorei ra. Create woe here, according to the NJPS. Others would say create evil. Is it sorrow? Is it evil? There are a number of reasons why there's a semantic range here. Different folks translate it differently. The core point is, however you translate it, our ancient sages decided to include this idea, but turn it on its head in our daily morning service to say that God doesn't merely just create good and evil. God creates whatever sorrow is in the world from God's hands, as it were. As our creator, God has already put the potential for harmonizing, for turning that frown upside down, to turn that sorrow, that evil, into a potential for goodness. And so that it is through goodness every day that God renews creation. I want to pause for a second and just see, before we move on to the next section, which is to look at one way with instead of showing you rabbinic texts about how else in other places the rabbis frame this idea of Hamechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit, that how God is the one who renews creation through goodness every day. sort of reactions, positive, negative questions, comments that you have about the way that the rabbis are rewriting things a bit here. What do you make of this? What are they attempting to do? Maybe do you identify with it perhaps in this season of trying to rewrite what it was undeniably a terrible year, 2020, and not that there weren't weddings and babies born and things that were objectively positive about it for some of you, or at least for some of humanity, but 200,000 dead here in the United States. Rising numbers in Canada, by the way. I fear I must mention from my nephew who is at university in Canada. Well aware that we're not alone on this continent, experiencing some challenges. Mexico too, through goodness. Whose goodness? Ours or God's? Yvonne says. Right. Good question. Is there a line here? God's reality versus our reality. Are we perhaps included in this? That is exactly the spiritual turn I'll be taking as we move on to the second page of the material here, is ways that we include ourselves then in this narrative of the rabbis, in looking at the renewal of creation, not just annually, but daily. What's our part in this drama, in this narrative? Any other reactions to this, these first texts? Right. So my mom says, yeah, by the way, my mom's on. So everybody, please, watch what you write in the comment box. She, so my mom says that she tries to look at a new opportunity in a different way. However much it might be similar to something that she undertook previously, how is it going to be different from what she has done previously? And that's a nice way of framing it, that it doesn't have to be. Perhaps the renewing through goodness is, the goodness is maybe the patience that a few of you referred to, and resilience that we need in order to gird ourselves for the need and the challenge of renewal, that it's not so easy to see what's going to be new. And so gaining some emotional distance in order to gain perspective. Great. Jennifer says, when confronted with the presence of evil, at least there is clarity. That could be considered good. Sure. Yes. Perspective again is huge in terms of gaining wisdom. I think Kohelet would even agree with that. And Gloria says, if we are co-workers, I'm going to guess that forkers here should be workers, unless there's an unintended joke here, I'm not getting. If we are co-workers with God, we must be involved every day in acts of goodness and kindness. It is our responsibility to create every day. Excellent. I could not agree more, Gloria. And what a wonderful way to frame the spiritual question here with then what kind of behavior does this kind of perspective, this rabbinic concept require of us? Let's turn back to the text then with some of these reactions in mind. Okay. Share screen. So again, rather than show you a litany of texts that delve more deeply into this from the rabbinic tradition, what I want to offer you is the possibility of a new spiritual practice for yourselves, is to look, especially as we're not only entering Sukkot, of course, next weekend is Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, where we end the Torah cycle of 5780 and begin the new Torah cycle of 5781. So we'll be returning to the beginning of the Torah, and it's not merely getting a week's jump on Simchat Torah for preparing that, but that I commend to you, perhaps if this spiritual practice speaks to you, how you can look at the account of creation daily for some of these lessons. And by no means are these the only lessons. These are 3 snippets from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that offer some opportunities for thinking about the ways that we create renewal in our lives, again, not just in this season, but daily. So the first is the idea of creating order from chaos. I'm very much been thinking about what lockdown was like this past spring here in New York, and preparing for the possibility of more chaos and such in this winter. So the first verses of the Torah of Genesis 1 tell us, you know what, this is nothing new. In fact, this is where creation begins, or at least a narrative of creation begins. When God began to create heaven and earth, this is the New Jewish Publication Society, by the way. This is not at the beginning. It's when God began to create heaven and earth. There are a lot of rabbinic traditions that say creation actually began before what you're reading here, before these verses. There are all kinds of things that were created before what happens here in these 5 verses, but the earth being unformed and void. So there's this primordial chaos that isn't just about, it's the lack of form and lack of structure, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, let there be light. And there was light. God said that the light was good. So here we have God naming the positivity here in creating not just so-called order from chaos, but that what is being created is an improvement upon. And that and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, a first day. Each of the first 5 days of creation continues to do this, a separation between what was there primordially and then what happens in this process. Each of the days, and then second 5 days, there is then an additional then embellishment upon what was good in that initial structuring. Let's fast forward then to the creation of humankind. Again, this is about us. How are we reading ourselves into this perspective, this narrative that the rabbis have offered us in our daily shacharit service? So this is, again, the New Jewish Publication Society translation. We'll turn to a different translation in just a second for part 2, as it were, of the creation of humankind. So verse 26, and God said, let us make man, which is a whole other conversation, by the way, I'll put in the parking lot for all of you. Who is this us? Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmenu. To whom is God speaking? Not a conversation for this class itself, actually, but one you can take into your research for next weekend. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. So this humanity, this humanoid, is meant to have sort of a certain level of position in a hierarchy above the other created animals. And God created man in his image, I mean God's own image. Unfortunately, of course, this is a gendered statement. However, if you read further, in the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Here we see that the language is failing us, trying to translate the gendered Hebrew into English, where there isn't an attempt to call God male. It's to say God is actually both male and female, and we have both male and female within us, however much we might be of one gender, sex, or the other in our identity, however we identify, but that our origins are bi-gendered, and that is a reflection of God's own image. Okay, so there might be something there to delve into in terms of how are we renewing ourselves, our sense of identity. But so again, further into our place within this creation, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. and to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth in which there is the breath of life, I give all green plants for food. And it was so. I pause here. Yes, there is one more verse. The point is that in these 3 verses, we have a statement from God, not merely of position in hierarchy, but of purpose. That according to this biblical narrative, upon which the rabbis are now building and delving more deeply, that daily, every morning, in fact, we are meant not just to give God praise for having created this structure of the world, of the universe, and our so-called position within it, but our sense of purpose. What is it that we are meant to do in this ecosystem? What is it that we are spiritually meant to be fulfilling as God's image in this world? So a couple of you have referred to this sort of spiritual concept that we are God's co-workers, that we are God's partners in creation. What does that mean? And I believe that the only way to answer that question of what does that mean is to be engaged in a daily process of thinking about these texts and where we see ourselves in them. I noticed that there are a couple more folks who've entered into the chat box. I want to move to the 3rd text here before we pause and unpack these 3 vignettes, these 3 passages. So that's one version, by the way, and this last verse before I change the page here, go to our last page of texts, by the way, is the verse with which I will be opening Kiddush. This is one tradition, is not to start with Vayechu Hashemayim Va'aretz, but this last verse in some traditions is the one with which folks start Friday night Kiddush. Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hine tov me'od vayi erev vayivoker yom hashishi. And God saw all that he had made and found it very good, exceedingly good. So that somehow this humanity as the so-called crowning of creation is not just good, but very good. What does that mean? What is it that our place in creation adds of value to the ecology around us that doesn't need us, but that God, seeing us as God's image in this world, makes God think, this is actually, this is a superlative. So this is the Everett Fox translation, which I'll read through very quickly. At the time of Adonai, God's making of earth and heaven, there was no human Adam to till the soil Adamah. And Adonai, God, formed the human Adam of dust from the soil Adamah, that he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. Adonai, God, planted a garden in Eden, land of pleasure, in the east, and there he placed the human whom he had formed. Adonai, God took the human and set him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch it. La'ovda u'lashomra. So very quickly, because I want to close with the framing, and I apologize, given the time, we might get less unpacking done here than I would have liked. So this 3rd vignette is the 2nd narrative of creation here. There are a lot of ways that folks have tried to make sense of the fact that there are 2 different stories juxtaposed. What I want to focus on here is simply what Everett Fox, a scholar from Clark University who is an observant practicing Jew and loves the poetry of the Torah, to bring out in his translation here, is the intended wordplay. That we are essentially not just God's image in the world, that we are essentially soil. Adam from Adamah, that we are essentially earthlings. And one translation here is that the Adam, that's not Adam and Eve, that's Adam, earthling, until the earthling who was of 2 genders was split in half and became what the text calls Adam and Eve, Adam v'Chava. And so ways in which we place ourselves in an ecosystem, noticing ourselves as not merely at the top of a food chain, atop of a hierarchy, but as essentially connected to the soil on which we live, even if we are not soil tenders and tillers, connected to farming and food production, we are still, in more than just in the words of Job, dust and ashes. We are actually living, breathing soil. What does that do daily to reconnect? Is that a humbling thing? Is that a centering kind of thing? A lot of ways that folks and our rabbis have in generations past made meaning out of that and a sense of a purpose out of that. We'll close with this text. What about a do-over? All right, so if one idea is if daily we are renewing creation, especially from goodness, from positivity, is that sort of a warm, fuzzy kind of thing? Well, not necessarily. It is meant as a core spiritual teaching for us, an ethical teaching. What does it mean to live a good life? It means to be engaged in the kind of back and forth that we see here among the houses of Shammai and Hillel, the students of two of our greatest ancient sages. So we learn from the Babylonian Talmud Bavli Eruvin 13b, Tanu Rabbanan Shtei Shanim Umachetzi Nechlaku Beit Shammai Uveit Hillel, that for 2.5 years, these houses were divided. Shammai said, better that humanity had not been created at all. Hillel said, it is better that humanity was created rather than not created. They voted between the two houses and concluded it would have been better had humanity not been created, fine. But now that humanity exists, man exists, let him probe his ways. So given that we're already 5 minutes past the hour, and I know we need to come in for landing here, what I want to ask of all of you is to the extent that these ideas, these texts speak to you, and this lens might have enduring value for you in the days, weeks, months, and year ahead, is for us to be using this daily practice of the rabbis, to be opening up our eyes and warming up our bodies for the world each day, of Hamechadesh Betuvo B'choyam Timim Aseh Bereshit, that not only does God renew the work of creation through goodness and positivity each day, but that we are meant to probe our own ways, our pasts, in order to be better people, to be better partners for God, with God in creation, in this sense that it probably would have been better, unfortunately, and especially with the sense of what's happening with climate change, if we had not been created. But so what? We can't undo that. And the essential point is, now that we've been created, God needs us, or we're not going to improve upon this world and to correct, to straighten all the things that we have twisted in that initial language of Kohelet. I'm going to very quickly go back to the chat box to see if there are any burning comments. Stop share. And great. So I'm glad that a few of you have had reactions in these last 10 minutes about what redoing looks like and using creative power to overcome our current challenges. An interesting metaphor that Adam was a park ranger or deputy. I like that. I want to hold on to that. That's not something I had quite considered previously. But yes, caretaker is a more common metaphor here, framing. Thank you, Tanya, for both of those. So I will close now, and just thank you for your time and your attention. And I'm glad that Julie was able to include the PDF in your chat box if you want to review this material later.